I had a way then, losing it all on my own. I had a heart then, but
What's up guys, Husky-Flies back here with another Litchi tutorial, and today is going to be lesson number 3, which is going into the main menu settings. Some of these are very important to ensure safe flight, and others are just important because you might want to change them at some point. So without further ado, we are going to go ahead and hop into it. So if you look to the upper right corner of the screen just above the VR icon, you'll see 3 cogs, and that is how you actually get to the main menu settings. Just a forewarning, while you are in the main menu settings, your video feed will be down, so you won't be able to see your videos, so that's just something to keep in mind. So we're going to go ahead and tap those 3 cogs, and it will open up the settings menu, and we're going to go ahead and start looking over some of these settings. So first we're under the general tab, and that first option is units, and you can choose between imperial or metric. Imperial will make your height and distance in feet and your speed in miles per hour for your telemetry. Metric will make your height and distance in meters and your speed in kilometers per hour for your telemetry. The next option right below that is called Show Battery Voltage, and I will go ahead and throw up a screenshot of exactly what it does. Essentially below your quadcopter's battery meter, it's going to show the exact voltage of the battery at any given point in the flight. So the next option below that is Show Home Orientation. So essentially with this turned on, there is going to be a green line at all times on the live map between the quadcopter and its home point, essentially where it took off from. If you turn it off, that line is no longer there. I suggest leaving this on. It makes it far easier to sort of navigate back home if you are flying long distance. So here you can see the Show Home Orientation turned off. Again, between the red triangle and the home point there is no line, but if we turn it on, go back to our map, you can see that there's a green line present, which will be very helpful for your navigation. Moving right along, because we got a lot of these to get through. The next up is Show GPS Coordinates, and that's going to essentially append to the end of your height, distance, and speed telemetry. It will append the current GPS coordinates of the quad. Probably pretty useless information, but you might be able to use it in recovering the quadcopter. I'm not sure exactly what the point is to having it on. So the next option is the map type, and you can choose between standard, satellite, and hybrid. Standard is essentially going to be a white map with no sort of topographical detail. It's not going to show buildings or trees or anything like that, but it will show street names. Satellite is going to have the topographical data. It's going to show satellite images of the area, but it will not have the street names. Hybrid is essentially the satellite map with the street names on it. So the next option is the map auto zoom, and that's something else I always think you should keep on. It will essentially zoom out and zoom in the live map to always show your location, the home point location, and the quadcopter location, so you get a good sense of the relative distance and position between all 3. Whereas if it's turned off, you might lose one or the other on the edge of the map. Next up is the map safe area radius, and essentially what this is going to do is whatever amount you enter for the distance, it's going to create a red circle on the map around the home point, and whatever distance you set in is the radius of that circle. I don't believe it will actually stop your quad from flying outside of the circle, but it's just sort of extra telemetry for your information. So if you decide I only want to go 1,600 feet out from the home point today, then you can enter that in and you will get clear feedback on the map as to when you're approaching the edge of that area. Next we have the Find My Aircraft option. As you can see, if I tap that, it's going to take me to a full screen Google Maps that will show my position as the blue dot and the quadcopter position as the red triangle. I believe this is to be used in emergency situations, basically for when you've crashed the quad and you're having trouble finding it. So moving on down the list, the last few options in the General tab are Reset All Settings, Pretty self-explanatory. That's just going to reset any settings that you've put into these menus. Help, again, pretty self-explanatory. And then the last option is language, which will obviously change the language that these settings show up in. So next we're going to begin working down the camera tab. The first option is auto record. Essentially, if you forget to hit the record button a lot when you're taking off, that will take care of that for you and automatically do it for you. Next we have video format. Just as with DJI Go, we can choose MOV or MP4s for our video encoding. So next up we have the anti-flicker option. Sometimes you can get flickering in your video. I've never personally had this issue, but you might want to mess with the options there if that is an issue for you. I've always left it on auto and it has been fine. So next up we have the show camera controls. If you remember correctly, on the main FPV screen on the right side there is a cluster of settings for your camera. This will essentially hide those. So if you are in manual exposure mode, for example, you can use your transmitter to control them, and that frees up that area of the screen for, your histogram or whatever you want to throw over there. Speaking of which, the next option is to turn on and off the histogram. So the histogram is a tool used for videography and photography, and there are plenty of videos out there showing exactly how to use it, but I'll just throw up a quick picture of what it looks like, and this option basically shows that or hides that on your FPV screen. It's also worth noting, when you have the histogram shown, you can hold your finger on it and move your finger around to essentially move it anywhere you want to on the screen. You can also hit that X in the upper left corner to hide it. So the next option is to show or hide the grid lines. Anyone who's used DJI Go is very familiar with this option. You basically have it as hidden. You have your basic grid lines, or you have your grid lines with diagonals, and these essentially assist in properly centering a subject. Next up we have the preview quality, and this is essentially the quality of the downlink video to your smart device. I've always kept on the default, which is 6 megabytes per second, but I believe it can go between 4 and 10 megabytes per second. So next up we have the transmission channel selection, and you can choose between either automatic, or you can choose between up to 31 separate channels. Something interesting for those who have used DJI Go, you'll know that that app only used channels like 10 to 18 or something like that. Basically only 8 channels. This app will utilize all 31 channels, which will, probably increase your range and stability of your both your transmitter control and your video downlink quite a bit. So that's a neat feature. So finishing off the camera tab, we only have 2 more options. We have double output HDMI, which essentially allows you to use HDMI Out to mirror the FPV, basically the image of Litchi, onto another monitor. Of course you'll need the module for the back of it, or you could potentially use this with some sort of tablet that has HDMI Out, like the NVIDIA Shield, but flipping that on will allow you to mirror it basically onto a bigger monitor using HDMI Out. And the last one, another self-explanatory option, is the format SD card, which will format the SD card on the actual quad, basically clear out all your videos and stuff so you can get back to recording if you're running out of space. So next up we are going to go into the aircraft tab. We have the go home altitude. The way the quadcopter acts when you initiate a go home is it's going to ascend to whatever altitude you specify here, then head home, then descend down from that altitude once it's reached the home point. If it is above whatever altitude you set here, it will not descend to it. It will stay above it as it's heading back, basically to ensure that it doesn't run into objects. Once again, the FAA legal limit in the United States is 400 feet, so I have mine currently set to 394 feet, and that will keep it pretty high, so it will hopefully not hit anything on the way back. After that, you have your maximum altitude, which is the maximum altitude you can fly the quadcopter up to before it stops you from ascending. Something to note here, the maximum altitude will always override the go home altitude. So if you have your go home altitude set to 400 feet, but your maximum altitude is only 200 feet, I believe it's only going to ascend to that 200 feet before heading back, so that's something to keep in mind. Next up, we have the dynamic home point. Essentially, whenever the quadcopter takes off, it's going to mark whatever location it's at as its home point, and when you hit a return to home, that's going to be where it tries to land. The dynamic home point tracks the GPS on your smart device, essentially your position, because that's what you have connected to your transmitter. It tracks the position of your smart device and moves the home point to wherever you've moved to. So it ensures that when you hit that return to home, the quadcopter is going to be moving back to you instead of its original home point. This is very useful for launching off of a vehicle such as a boat or a car or whatever, so you can drive around or drive the boat around, and the home point's always going to be updated to your current position. After that, we have the signal lost behavior for manual flying, and essentially what this means is you're going to choose the behavior that the quadcopter takes when it loses communication with the transmitter. Not necessarily your video downlink. Your video can drop and you still have control of the quad from the transmitter, but when it actually drops out and is getting no data from the transmitter itself, basically you have no control over the quad. That's going to define what it does. The three options are landing, return to home, and hover. Hover will cause the quad to basically use its GPS to hover in its position until it can reestablish a link up with the transmitter. Landing is going to cause it to automatically attempt to land at whatever location it's currently at whenever it breaks communication. And return to home will initiate the return to home function, so it will begin flying back and attempt to land at its home point. I suggest leaving it on return to home, safest bet for getting the quad back, and even if you can't reestablish connection as it comes back to its home point, you're definitely going to hear it and see it coming down, so I would leave it on that. Next up, we have the option to turn on or off the vision positioning system. This is that set of 3 sensors on the bottom of the Phantom, or the Inspire, basically the optical flow and the 2 sonar sensors. The only reason I can think of that you would want to turn these off is I know that they can act really strangely over water, so if you're ever flying over a lake or the ocean or whatever, usually you're going to want to turn these off ahead of time. Next up, we have the option to start a compass calibration, just as with DJI Go. The key difference here is when you're using Litchi, it's actually going to talk to you and tell you what to do, whereas DJI Go will just pop up basically the step-by-step directions on the screen. This can be very useful because you can lay your transmitter down and keep it a safe distance away from the quadcopter while you're calibrating the compass, and essentially just listen for the direction from your smart device as Litchi tells you what to do next. So another useful feature that it has over DJI Go in my opinion. So moving on down the list, these next 5 options are pretty much to be used with healthydrones.com, but I will go over them very briefly. So you have your ability to log flights, just as DJI Go does. It will log your flights as well. You can turn the ability to log flights on and off. Healthydrones.com user token, that's to be used with healthydrones.com, and for those who don't know, that's a site that is really neat. It basically, you can sync up your flights within. It will go into excruciating detail on the telemetry. It will also allow you to export your flight in a CSV format for use with Dashware if you want to overlay your telemetry onto your videos. So pretty neat there. Anyways, the user token is something you get on the site that essentially tells it which account to send the logs to. So you enter that in there and hit test, and if it succeeds, then it has found your account and will send the logs there. The automatic sync automatically syncs your logs with healthydrones.com after each of your flights. It will sync photo and video previews on that next option, essentially thumbnails of when you start and video recording and when you take still photos. And then the last option there is to sync with healthydrones.com right now. So for whatever reason the auto sync isn't working, you can hit that. So now moving down past all of that, we have automatic takeoff follow mode as the next option. That will essentially, I believe that's going to enable the aircraft to take off on its own if you put it into follow me mode. Not something I would suggest doing. I'd suggest kind of getting it up in the air first, but that's your risk to take if you wish. So essentially, if that's turned off, I don't think the aircraft will be able to take off when you initiate follow me. So I would probably leave that off, but again, that's up to you. You have the maximum location accuracy. That has to deal with follow me as well as a couple of the other intelligent flight modes in Litchi. I would not touch that. I'd leave that at the 49 feet, but essentially that's going to set the threshold of how accurate it is when it's determining your location. Next we have gimbal FPV mode, just as with DJI Go. This stops the stabilization and essentially locks the gimbal rigid in place, so you're going to see every movement of the quadcopter in your video. We have the gimbal extension plus 30 degrees. This will allow you to tilt the gimbal upwards 30 more degrees than you normally would. It's disabled by default just because you're basically going to be guaranteed to get the props and arms in your video, but I like to leave it on just because sometimes you can get some extra video without the props or arms in it. So that essentially allows you to rotate that extra 30 degrees upwards on the gimbal. Next up is the gimbal gesture control. On the FPV screen, you can hold your finger to the screen and pull your finger down and push it up in order to tilt the gimbal down and up that way, as opposed to using the dial on your transmitter. The gesture, turning that gesture control off will disable that option, and turning it on will enable that option. And the very last option in the aircraft tab of the preferences is front aircraft LEDs. This is very simple. Turning them on will turn on the LEDs on the underside of the front arms of your quad. Turning these off will turn off the LEDs on the underside of the front arms of your quad. Now we are on to the speech tab of the Litchi app, and this tab controls all of the audible feedback you'll get from Litchi while you're flying. There are two primary types. You have basically your regular feedback that it's going to repeat every so often while the quadcopter is in flight, and then you have your warnings feedbacks. There are two warnings. There's a warning for when the battery drops below a certain percentage, and there's also a warning for when the satellite count drops below a certain percentage. So these two types are configured kind of separately. But up at the top you can see you can either turn on the speech or turn off the speech. So basically keep it completely quiet or allow it to speak to you. That feedback frequency right there is going to be only applied to your regular, basically the regular audible feedback, not the warning. So it's going to be applied to altitude, distance, speed, and battery. And you can set that to whatever you want to. I keep it at 300 seconds every 5 minutes. It's short enough that I can get good feedback and long enough that it doesn't get terribly annoying. Each of those options below determines exactly what it's going to read back to you when basically that frequency timer is up and it speaks to you. So you can choose to turn on or off altitude, on or off distance, on or off speed, and on or off battery. And I'm going to go ahead and play an example for you with all of these turned on.
0 feet altitude, 0 feet distance, 0 miles per hour, 98% battery.
So there you could hear that is what it sounds like with all of the feedback turned on. And that timer begins, it will say everything once whenever you take off, and then it begins counting down until it says it again, and it will keep that timer refreshing for as long as the quadcopter's in flight. So at the bottom of the speech tab in the settings, you can see your warnings frequency. This is a separate timer from the regular feedback, and it's only used for when the warnings begin. So you can see here you have two options for your warnings. You can tell it to give you audible feedback when your battery drops below a certain percentage. So in this case, it would be once it hit 24%, it would start giving me feedback that my battery was, going low. And you can warn if satellite count drops below a certain amount. So in this case, whenever I hit 5 satellites or lower, it would begin warning me. And the frequency used for these is totally separate from the normal feedback, as I said. So you might have 300 seconds set in for all of that feedback that you just heard a minute ago. But if you only have 60 seconds set in for the warnings and you're below 25% battery or below 6 satellites for this example, then it's going to use the frequency for the warnings. But pretty simple, pretty easy to get a hang of, so I'm sure that's more than enough information on that. Alright guys, so now we're at the last tab of the menu, and as you can see here, it looks very daunting, but it's really not that bad. This tab of the menu deals entirely with binding your C1 and C2 keys. So for those that are using a Phantom with the upgraded transmitter, which I think would be the Advanced, the Professional, the 4K, and the Phantom 4 more recently, you're going to notice you have two switches on the back of the transmitter. The left side is C1, the right side is C2 as labeled here in this menu. As for the standard transmitter, I have never had my hands on one, so I couldn't tell you if those have the switches or not, and if there are any standard users and it doesn't, then I'm sorry. But this is, I have the Advanced, so it's what I'm basing all of this information off of. Anyways, so you have the bindings for each C1 and C2, and essentially in the second part, you're gonna sort of the second tab there, you see C1 FPV, C2 FPV, then you see C1 waypoint, C2 waypoint. This essentially is bindings specific to the different flight modes within Litchi. So your bindings of those two keys on the back of the transmitter might be different when you're in waypoint mode versus when you're at the FPV screen or when you're in orbit mode. So this allows you to configure the keys for any of those different modes, and you can explore that on your own. You can go ahead and hit those tabs and see what all of the options are in there. I've left it mostly on the defaults. But yeah, that's what this last tab of the settings menu is for. And with that, I think we have completed our tutorial of the main menu settings. I appreciate you guys sticking it out with me. I know this was a particularly long one. I believe for the next lesson we are going to go a little bit deeper into VR, the VR option in Litchi, which won't be too terribly long because truthfully there's not a whole lot to say about that other than what you can do with it. So once again, Husky-Flies here. Thanks guys for watching. I hope this video helped you in some way, and if it did, make sure to hit that like and subscribe. Thanks.